The Epigenetics of Intergenerational Trauma. Before I begin, I would like to give a trigger warning. This video will obviously cover topics about trauma and PTSD, and some of the stories I've included are from survivors of the Holocaust. While I will not go into too much depth, please be aware of your limits as a viewer and a listener. I've provided resources at the end for anyone who would need them. When I was in the 7th grade, we read a book called Night by Elie Wiesel. It's one of those books that sticks with you years after you've read it. A survivor of the Holocaust, Wiesel details the invasion of Hungary by Nazi Germany in 1944, his experiences in the concentration camps, and ultimate liberation in 1945. Near the end of the book, Wiesel writes the following quote: "For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear. His duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprave future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." Elie Wiesel is not the only survivor to speak about his experiences of the Holocaust, although he is arguably one of the most famous. Many came forward to the public so future generations would not forget, while others simply told their children when the time was right. In the 1990s, Rachel Yehuda, a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience, began a Holocaust outreach center in Mount Sinai in New York City. The goal was to offer support for those who needed help with their trauma. Trained counselors and therapists were available for those who wished to talk. Surprisingly, more of the callers on their helpline were from the children of survivors and not the survivors themselves. One individual, we'll call him Joseph, said that he was a casualty of the Holocaust. He lived each day with fear that something terrible would happen. He learned several forms of self-defense and always kept cash and jewelry on hand. After reports of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, he'd started to have panic attacks and nightmares. When we experience something scary or traumatic, our body starts to send signals to prepare itself. The hypothalamus and pituitary glands, both located in the brain, and the adrenal system located in the kidneys, collectively known as the HPA axis, work together to send signals to the autonomic nervous system. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are secreted throughout the body and begin a chain reaction. Some of these reactions include tunnel vision, increased heart rate, fast breathing, increased sweating, and slowing digestion. Your brain begins to send signals to increase or decrease the amount of stress hormones that are released. Once your body is convinced there is no other threat, bodily functions begin to return to normal. This stress cycle occurs more than we think. It happens during a scary movie or on a roller coaster ride. But in the case of a traumatic event, perhaps the death of a loved one, domestic violence, rape, war, a natural disaster, etc., this stress cycle can last for a long period of time and can be triggered weeks, months, or even years after the event has occurred. This is called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. After the Holocaust ended, many survivors continued to live in fear for their lives and experience flashbacks of the trauma they had endured. So why did their children, who had lived without experiencing such horrors, have the same PTSD symptoms as their parents? While we usually think of genetics in terms of Punnett squares and alleles, certain behaviors or an environment can cause changes which affect how genes work. This study is known as epigenetics. One of the most studied changes in epigenetics is DNA methylation. Methyl groups can be added to our DNA, which effectively turn genes on or off, so to speak. For those who experience PTSD, they often have low levels of cortisol. In terms of acute trauma, cortisol effectively regulates blood pressure and boosts energy to handle stress. But for prolonged periods of time, cortisol can be toxic to the body by weakening the immune system. For individuals with PTSD, a methyl group is added to DNA to decrease the amount of cortisol that can be released. This methylation is then inherited by future generations. One question remains for many researchers: is intergenerational trauma caused by genetics or just bad parenting? To test this question, Isabel Monsui, a professor of neuroepigenetics, used mice to learn more about intergenerational trauma. In the experimental group, she bred traumatized males with quote-unquote normal females, but quickly removed the fathers so they would not affect their offspring. In the control group, she then bred normal males with normal females. Once the mice had been weaned from their mothers, they all grew up together. Immediately, the offspring of traumatized males started to show more risk-taking behaviors by exploring parts of the cage. But when they fell into the pool of water, they would stop swimming much faster than the control mice and give up. This is indicative of depressive behavior, according to Mansuy. So what does this all mean? Firstly, mice are great for experiments because they have shorter lifespans. Mansuy was able to study up to 6 generations. But mice are not humans, so there is no guarantee that intergenerational trauma is genetic because studies have shown that to be true in mice. There is still a lot more research to be done in this field. Secondly, a parent's experience does not determine their child's experience. Rachel Yehuda, in her studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, noticed a shortage of a certain enzyme in Holocaust survivors. It's called 11-beta HSD2. For convenience, we'll call it 11-beta. During periods of food deprivation, the body lowers levels of 11-beta to increase metabolic fuel for survival. Researchers believe that their children would also have low levels, which could affect eating habits and digestion. Instead, the opposite was true. You see, 11-beta is also present in placenta during pregnancy. The children of survivors produced more of 11-beta to protect itself from the mother's cortisol, which can be toxic. As Yehuda explains, just as a parent was able to survive trauma by means of biological adaptations, offspring can sometimes adapt to the biological impact of their parents' trauma. Thirdly, and most importantly, open communication is necessary to helping others. Joseph's mother was honest about her experiences in the Holocaust, not to scare her son, but so he could understand what had happened and succeed where others had failed. Parents should help in offering their children resources so that they can safely unpack their anxieties and understand how trauma can affect them, but also understanding that trauma does not have to consume them. Thank you so much for watching this video. Here are the articles and journals that I used to understand this topic. And finally, these are 3 resources for anyone who needs them. Reaching out for help is not a sign of weakness, but one of strength. As someone who has experienced trauma, the best thing you can do is talk to a professional and learn healthy coping mechanisms. Thank you again.